Hello and welcome to my channel where it's Halloween all year long. My name is Lauren. Welcome back. Originally at the start of November, I had this plan to do a video about the Indian burial ground trope that shows up in a lot of horror films and books. I still might actually do that video in the future, but this past November during Thanksgiving week that I had off from work, I read 3 books from Indigenous authors that in one way or another touch the genre of horror. Those books included White Horse by Erika Wurth, which is a very new release, and then 2 books by Stephen Graham Jones, which you very much likely know if you're familiar with the horror genre. And I read one novella, which is called Mapping the Interior. And then the second book I read of Stephen Graham Jones is the super popular The Only Good Indians. I wanted to read these books in the month of November for a variety of reasons. One of which I feel like Thanksgiving to me always comes to mind, a lot of misrepresentations of American history. And so I thought it was kind of topical to fill that month with Indigenous people's voices and their own stories about what it means to live in what is now the United States. I also knew that the break was week-long and that I could really devote a lot of my time, my emotions, and mental space to really diving deeply into these 3 books, the social commentary that they're bringing up, the historical references and allusions, both overt and a little bit more subtle. So I really wanted to see how these 3 books are like in conversation with one another. I really don't think these 3 books are books, personally, I feel can just be read super quickly and then you just like move on and kind of just mark that book, tally it up as like something read. I think these are books that are very much deserving of our emotional space and our mental capacity sitting with what these writers are saying and really the message that they're trying to communicate to their audiences. So because I have this background in US history and I knew the general premises of these 3 books, I wanted to make sure I gave myself the space to just really feel and like go to the places that these authors really want us as readers to go to. And I was super curious too at the start of that week of reading how horror could be used to really tell the stories of Indigenous peoples who have a very long history, specifically within the United States, with genocide and those experiences that still have to this day impacts since the process of settler colonialism, this framework for understanding this loss of land and culture for Indigenous people is still an ongoing issue. And also it's just really important to understanding what these authors are saying too. So I feel like if you don't understand settler colonialism, a lot of what these books by Indigenous authors are trying to communicate, what they're trying to say, is gonna go over some people's heads. I really do feel that the genre of horror is one of the most effective ways of telling this very brutal and violent history. The experiences of Indigenous people need to be told, and their harms and acts of violence that happened in the past that continue to cause harm and pain in the descendants of people who have inherited that direct line of history. But also new forms of violence are continuing to be enacted on Indigenous nations and communities, both on reservations, outside of them. And so I think about, as a teacher myself, a lot of my students come into my classrooms with this huge misunderstanding that Indigenous people no longer exist. And that is a very harmful misunderstanding that gets perpetuated through a variety of sources and methods. And history has the tendency to be seen as something that is incredibly boring and dry. There's this disconnection in how it's taught through lack of emotions. And so you don't really feel connected to the past. And as a teacher, that's always a challenge I try to overcome through how I teach and tell the histories of what is now the United States. So I think when you use the genre of horror that is by definition aiming to disturb and frighten, I can't name anything more disturbing and frightening than the genocide that has been enacted on Indigenous peoples throughout history by the US government. The genre of horror is incredibly accessible for folks who might not be so interested in picking up a 400, 500 page nonfiction history book to really get to know the actual facts about what happens in the past and what continues to harm Indigenous nations and communities today, but also you get the emotional side of that entire process felt and experienced by you, a reader who is very likely not going to be of that Indigenous background or within that group. Something I feel like the teaching of history in the most like traditional sense doesn't get to effectively do in the majority of cases. Horror has a very, very special role to play in teaching the public, specifically non-Indigenous people, about what Indigenous people have experienced in the past and continue to have to grapple with today, both the ancestral harms, but also new harms that are continuing to be felt and experienced by Indigenous people. So getting into the actual book summaries and my thoughts on them, I read one book by Erika Wurth. She is an urban native who has Apache, Cherokee, and Chickasaw ancestry. White Horse is about a native woman who lives off of a reservation. She starts to see glimpses of the ghost of her mother once she touches this like ancestral item that was once her mom's. Her mom disappears when she was about like 2 days old. So she's walking around Earth with this assumption that her mom like abandoned her. And so that kind of becomes the seed that is planted that leads to a lot of kind of personality or character traits for Kari, who is the main character of this book. The major premise is trying to figure out what the ghost of her mother is trying to communicate to her, and there's a mystery that's trying to be solved around what happened to her mother and the disappearance. I really loved this book. You get a lot of slices of life, and so you do see a lot of people who I've watched say that this book is kind of on the slower side and they're just like wanting a little bit more action. So to that, I don't know, I get a little defensive because I feel like that's the same kind of critique I give to Stephen King's books, which the main character references a lot and really loves. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of some books. They're going to be a little bit more slower paced, so I feel like that's not a valid critique when that is something that Stephen King gets reamed for all the time and people still adore and love him as like the king of horror. You have the Lock Beautician, her YouTube channel. I'll link the video in the description box. She talks about how crime fiction, horror, anything within those two genres that is being told by Black or Indigenous people has been discredited as not being authentically crime fiction or horror. So she speaks a lot to that in a really great YouTube video that really helps me better understand and contextualize these books. I think the purpose of the slower moments where you don't see a lot of the quote unquote action, meaning appearances from the ghost and like the more like typical horror elements that are more traditional with the gore and the guts. I think the point is to show the life of an urban native, somebody who's living outside and off of a reservation, to really experience and see the side of her life. And I think this is a book that is more character driven rather than plot, and you get really great character development in this book where at the end of it you really feel a sense of closure in ways that I feel like The Only Good Indians kind of gives you, but kind of not, with the way things ended in a glorious fire of just violence and gore. So I really loved Kari. She was very complex. She was a flawed character, but not somebody that felt like a lost cause. I feel like I related a lot to Kari in the sense that like age-wise, we were so similar in just our mannerisms and what we like to do. Like there's a lot of scenes at a bar, which is what the namesake of this book is named after. It's kind of atmospheric, it's a vibe, it's very character driven, and you feel like the plot is there to help show and move along the character development. The plot is there to serve the characters' development over time and how they grow in their understanding of not only themselves, but who they are in relationship to their cultural identity, who they are to their family. I think it's a very sophisticated book because you see over time, a very short period of time, the main character, Kari, just like step into themselves and really feel empowered. And the key to her empowerment is lying so much with the people who are in her life, her community, that are alive today, but also using the strength and wisdom and tools of her ancestors to help solve the contemporary issue that she's trying to face, the mystery she's trying to solve. I read Mapping the Interior first. I enjoyed it, but I do feel like I'm realizing as I read 2 Stephen Graham Jones books in 1 week, and then I've already read another one of his books, My Heart is a Chainsaw, that he is a person, he is an author that challenges me, and I really do love that. Like, I read his books, and I know they're not books I could read during the work week when I'm tired and exhausted and need something that's kind of like light and quick. He challenges me to be a more thoughtful and intentional, deep thinking reader. And I feel like this book is a book I will have to return to in subsequent years, which makes me very happy that I purchased this and have my own copy to come back to. I think there's parts that definitely went over my head that I just keep like gnawing on, trying to figure out what that meant and what that means to the story or the plot or the characters. It's a very sophisticated horror novel. This story follows a young family that is living off of a reservation. They were once living on that reservation, but since you have this single mom and her two children losing their father in like a freak, violent, mysterious accident, they've left their family, left their community on the reservation, trying to just seek some kind of like financial security that way. So you have Junior, one of her elder sons, seeing glimpses of the ghost of his dad, I think around like upper middle school. Just like White Horse, where you have lighter horror elements, this one also is very similar because you don't really have like the blood and the guts, but that doesn't mean that it's not unsettling what happens in this book, especially the ending. I did not see the ending coming. I had to read that like 3 or 4 times to really understand and grasp it. And when I kind of had it all click in my head, I was like, that's brilliant, but that is so unsettling, that's so disturbing, and says so much. Like, there is a message there that I think is very profound and important. Where I really found a lot of the blood and guts during my Thanksgiving week of reading was with The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This book snuck up on me because you just feel like you are meeting and getting introduced to one of the main characters in this book in the first few pages, and then bam, there is like gore, there is violence, you do not expect it, you do not see it coming. But this book follows a group of 4 young Indigenous men who at certain points in their time grew up on a reservation. Some leave, some stay. They have this like hunting experience around Thanksgiving, one of the years, like in their youth, that comes back to haunt them. And that is the chain of events that you get here. So you get very interesting points of views. This is less character heavy than White Horse. And I thought there were some really great allegories or like metaphors at play here regarding violence, just this idea of cycles of violence, generational violence, the choices you have as somebody who, without any choice or decision in the matter, you inherit these cycles of violence, and then how do you then choose to respond to them? So if I had to rank these 3 books in terms of my enjoyment, because I think they're all 3 important books that definitely need to be read, especially by non-Indigenous people, I'd probably say these 2 are going to be my fave, but I think by a hair, White Horse wins a bit, just because I felt like as a young woman, like entering their 30s, who has a long history of hanging out at dive bars, I thought that Kari's character really spoke to me, and I did appreciate how the plot is moved along through the ongoing development of its main character, Kari. But I did love how rich in metaphor this book embedded within its larger plot, and like the violence and the gore elements that you do see within these 3 books, similarities in terms of all of like the main characters seeking out strength and support from their ancestors, which I think is so beautiful. For example, in White Horse, you see the main character, Kari, utilizing a specific ancestral tool to combat the evil entity that she has to overcome within that story. And I think that's a beautiful message, that you are only as strong in the present moment, solving your problems, overcoming your challenges, as the knowledge you have and the connection you have to your past, which I think is very, very beautiful, to knowing that like history of a people is so important to knowing who you are in that present time. There's also a line in The Only Good Indians where you have one of the characters, it doesn't play like a huge role, but they really feel strength and empowerment through embodying Crazy Horse, who is an Indigenous tribal leader, super iconic, fought many battles against the US government. And so you have the question being asked, like, what would Crazy Horse do? So how the past can be a tool for the present in combating those systemic and structural barriers, I thought was just so powerful as somebody who lives and breathes history in my daily life. Another motif that shows up in all three of these books is going to be alcohol, and more specifically alcoholism. You see in White Horse how alcohol is almost in like every chapter. Like Kari drinks it, and she doesn't like ever really talk about how alcohol is an issue for her. She actually ends up, oftentimes at a bar. But we do see how alcohol plays a huge role in her family's lives in terms of like what they experience, like accidents. And there's a lot of commentary on alcohol, yet it's also being used as a productive thing in her life, which you'll see if you like read the book, a way to like financial security. And then within both of Stephen Graham Jones's books that I read that week, alcoholism is something that is causing a lot of harm to Indigenous peoples on reservations outside of it. So it's really interesting when you pick up in all three of these books that I read at the same time during the same week, that you see that motif of alcohol. And if you know about the history of Indigenous peoples, alcoholism is a huge systemic problem and something that has definitely been perpetuated by the US government and other entities working on behalf of it. And then another conversation that shows up in these books that I'm still trying to grapple with is the idea of like land, housing, reservations. You see in White Horse a really unique perspective of a urban native that is outside of the reservation, does not have that same kind of cultural ties. I think a perspective that is not necessarily shown a lot in media. And then you have Stephen Graham Jones giving us the majority of the book on a reservation. I thought that was very unique. And then mapping the interiors like somewhere right in between, where a young boy is kind of grappling with the consequences of leaving a reservation. And he's like mapping out, like literally drawing out the little mobile home that they have. And so there's this conversation regarding land and home and placement and like how your life changes when you're off of the reservation, in oftentimes many negative ways, feeling like an outsider, feeling like somebody that is an outsider to larger society when you leave these reservations. But also reservations not necessarily being these places of safety from violence, like you still have those issues regarding like alcoholism, for example. And in White Horse, you see a lot of commenting regarding like gentrification and communities of color being pushed out, being priced out of those areas. So I don't think it's on accident that all three of these books written by Indigenous authors are commenting on land, housing, identity being tied to specific places of living. When you look at the relationship between the US government and the various Indigenous nations of North America, it all really does come down to land, like the dispossession of land, right? Circling back to this idea of settler colonialism, Indigenous communities are really tied to their land. Their land is important. They have certain practices, both religious and like sustenance and like just like finding food that like are relevant to that specific place of land. And many of those communities, if not the majority, have been moved from those original locations. And the consequences of that are still ongoing. There is still that ongoing struggle between Indigenous communities and space, feeling like there is no space for them to just be native and be themselves and feel supported by some government structure that has really never fully supported Indigenous communities. After reading these three books, I really do feel like they are grief horror. Like there's always in these books this pain, this agony that has yet to be healed, pain over the past that has yet to be healed, because pain is continuing to be enacted on Indigenous communities. So how can you heal from violence that is ongoing? You cannot. So there's so much grief I felt from these books, so much pain at how their ancestors were treated and how that, knowing that pain happened, causes pain for these characters. And then they have a mother they're trying to find and locate. In another book, you have a young boy who is entering their teenage years and so much grief over the death of their father, and how that is playing a huge role in why they're even like experiencing and seeing them. Just the ways that these three books demonstrated, just the ways that they made real the levels of violence and grief and ancestral pain that they carry with themselves as modern natives really is perfectly illustrated through various horror elements, whether it's a ghost or a deer woman. There are these horror elements that can communicate what is so challenging to communicate, which is the emotions, that emotional impact behind a lot of this history, that if you don't know it, you're walking around just not really aware that these are the realities of living people today. And I think it's especially important that we take time to not just read, but like seek to understand the works of Indigenous authors in all genres, especially horror, because of the ways historically that Indigenous communities have been portrayed in books that they had no participation in the creation of. Like, I'm talking historically too, where you have, since before the United States was the United States during the colonial time period, Indigenous people being written about, characterized as godless heathens, as savages, as the murderers, as these monsters. And so a lot of what I notice is like these authors, especially Stephen Graham Jones, like turning the table on who is the monster, who is the villain. And so this new renaissance of Indigenous authors, specifically within the horror genre, is doing so much of their work in response to these very racist works that are as old as like the 1600s. Erika T. Wurth and Stephen Graham Jones are just one of many Indigenous authors today that are forging new representations of Indigenous people's lives, both past and present, that are both brutally honest, complex, and ever-changing. So in the future, I'm really looking forward to reading more horror novels, horror short story anthologies, novellas by Indigenous authors. Two I have on deck are going to be Shane Hawk's Anoka, which is a short story anthology that I think is focused on just like one specific town. Sounds super fascinating. I like that premise for a short story anthology. And then the next is going to be Bad Crees by Jessica Johns. I know this was a very different approach to my typical recent reads updates, but I felt that these three books really deserved the space to kind of dive deeply into their messages, their social commentary, and maybe you've read these books. I'd love to know if you have the same similar kind of reactions, if you notice similarities, connections within themes and motifs present within all three, or maybe just like two of these books. And I'd love if you had any recommendations for more horror novels, horror books written by Indigenous authors. Please leave them in the comments below. And also let me know if you did want me to cover the Indian burial ground trope within a future video. There is a lot to say there that I couldn't cover in just like a recent reads video. But thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you all in my next video. Bye.